Yeah, he does. He does. And they need to be a part of the church, and God preserves them through the church. But they will switch back to a national identity one day. And that needs to be known. But they're not a national identity necessarily now different than the church. They're preserved through the church. So they need to be a part of the church more than being separate from the church. So I think as long as they have the right perspective, I think too many of them just go to being too separate. And that's that's just personal opinion, but I think there's some doctrinal parts to that you're going to live in the part of the New Testament era of the church. You're a part of the church, and you need to be more a part of it than separate from it.
That's true. Then Ephesians 1 will talk about one man God made. One man. There's no division. It's not
right.
Jew nor Gentile.
Barbarian, Scythian, any of those, right? So it's a oneness idea in the church more than a separation idea. And even for them, they need to understand that their preservation is through the grace and mercy of God through the church at this time.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've never heard it expressed. I've learned some, Jews the word Christian. I've never heard it expressed like that. So from them,
right. And that's where I think they need to just a little more balance. And sometimes I think they have less balance of that, and a little more, maybe even a pride issue about their being Jewish.
It could be pride.
Yeah. So, okay, we're going to have to get into Exodus, or I'll never finish by the end of the year here. So, I think we left off in Exodus 15. You guys can tell me if I made it any further, but that's where I'm going to pick it up, and we can hit the motor running right away. Exodus 15 brings us to the conclusion of the actual events of the crossing of the Red Sea. I think we ended with the song of Moses and the praise that was given there in Exodus chapter 15, which is a great worship of Yahweh for his deliverance, right? And right away you get into, and the second half of Exodus chapter 15, you get into their first kind of testing in the wilderness. And so what's going to take place now in the book of Exodus, and kind of the transition that takes place in the second half of Exodus 15 through really the end of the book, is that you're going to see God leading Israel, and he's going to do so by displays of protection and providence. And you're going to see fickle Israel, complaining Israel and failing Israel time and again, which will become a pattern in the whole history of Israel, right? That you're never going to have a real super solid. They have times of following the Lord and times of falling away. That's kind of what the judges will picture, but it begins here. It really begins that that God is going to teach and instruct them through a series of providence and protection, and they're going to have a hard time learning the lesson. Okay, so one of them that takes place with the water in Exodus chapter 15. Where it says, Moses led Israel out from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. So right away you have a problem that God leads them into a problem on purpose. And he's, let's take you out there where there's no water. What are you going to do? God says, here, this is how I can provide, right? So the people grumbled and said, what shall we drink? They didn't come up and say, wow, we got a problem. How's God going to solve this? They went and grumbled to Moses. Language is very specific, complaining. That has the idea of not trusting. And they said, what shall we drink? And then he cried out to Yahweh, and Yahweh showed him a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. And there he set for them a statute and a judgment, and there he tested them. And he said, if you will earnestly listen to the voice of Yahweh your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all of his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you, which I have put on the Egyptians. For I, Yahweh, am your healer. And they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, and they camped there beside the waters. So God's leading, and he makes a distinction in this, and this is the distinction. You know how I can judge people, because I've shown you how I can judge the Egyptians, right? Now I'm going to show you how I can lead and provide. And I want you to know the difference. The difference is if you will trust me and obey me you'll see the provision. If you fail at that, you can experience some of the judgmental form that you remember from the Egyptians. You want to go back and see the punishment of God in the form of the Egyptian style? Or do you want to see the provision for my people? So you have that blessing and the cursing that kind of, Deuteronomy will picture in full. You see the first picture of it here. You either move forward into the provision of the Israelites, or you can experience the punishment along with the Egyptians, minor though it may be, right? But that's what the cursings represent, is that you've already seen it with the Egyptians. So he's putting in their mind and in their head. Did God lead them into this problem? He did. And then he says, here's the solution. You need to learn to trust me, or you can go back and grumble and join some of the punishment forms of the Egyptians. So that's the first test that comes out right after their crossing.
So, this is you're going to get to many more, but this is the first one, and it says they grumbled against Moses, and Moses cried out to God. Why don't they go directly? Do they still not feel that they can approach God? It has to go through Moses?
Yeah, part of it is, I think they lived 400 years in a kind of silence from God, right? The 400 years after Joseph, and they've not had the same understanding of, I'll call it the mechanics of how it works, right? So they've really not known God. So on the one side, God is teaching them. So this was not designed without a lesson, right? The lesson was God's going to provide, but it comes with a warning that because you can so easily go back into the not trusting mode, right? So God is letting them know. It's kind of like with Cain and Abel, right? If you do well, will not your countenance be turned, back around? But if you don't, sin is crouching at the door. Here's a national version of the same thing. He's saying, look, I'm going to show you how I can provide when there's nothing natural to provide for you. I can just bring provision. And then I'm going to show you again and again. And a part of the wilderness wandering is designed to be a teaching time, a whole teaching time, right? So that God knows they're not going to be great at it. God knows that they're going to fail at it. But then there's some pretty great failures when we get to the calf, right? You're like, oh my gosh, how could you turn that far around, right? But God, and I think a part of the picture that you begin to pick up on the provision of God and the failing of Israel is just how merciful God is, right? Holy cow, you have some great patience, because I would have burned them a long time ago. And, there's a few times when he was ready to, and the lesson was for Moses, right? So we'll see that, but get too far ahead. But you get little examples and big examples and multiple examples of God's great patience, because a part of it is he knows they need the instruction, and they need these great displays. They're getting personal. Exodus really has the most personal aspect of God's presence among his people. And we'll see some of the language of that as we go through, right? Here's one where you see now that God can provide. Now, there are times it gets a lot more personal with the presence of God. And so God, especially when you get to the mountain, right? The whole presence of God picture at Exodus, I think, is one of the biggest themes that you can get out of this, right? So this is what happens in lessons for the water, and then lessons for the manna in chapter 16, right? So you get to chapter 16, and it says they set out from verse 1, the whole congregation of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin. And it says there between Elim and Sinai, and on the 15th day of the second month after their departure from the land of Egypt, the whole congregation and the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. They have no food. And so now they had no water, and God was able to provide, and so they have no food. Do they think, well, God provided water, he can also provide food? They don't. They go right back into grumbling and complaining. And another lesson, right? So God says, I'm going to make this more personal. It's not just going to be, I'm going to show you food in the wilderness. I'm going to make it, right? I'm going to make the food from heaven. And so there's a more personal presence aspect of it. And this is what they say, right? This is the wood that we had dyed by the hand of Yahweh in the land of Egypt. when we sat by the pots of meat and when we ate bread to our full. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to put this whole assembly to death with hunger, right? Remember how good we had it in Egypt? You know the old Keith Green song, right? So you want to go back to Egypt. If you remember that song, it's like, wow. He did that song pretty good. Go listen to it. But, the garlics and the leeks and all that they said. Remember how we had it so great and we were just sitting by the river eating bread and eating to our full? That's not how it was at all. And they have a pretty skewed memory about it. But, that's how wicked we can be, right? It's selfishness to go, wow, God's not, there's nothing here for us. And what did God do? Is he bringing us out here to kill us? Is that how God has shown himself to you? No. But he illustrates with another lesson. He's teaching them. And again, this is the whole point, right? And then Yahweh said in verse 4, I will make it rain down bread from heaven for you. And the people should go out and gather today's portion every day, that I may test them whether or not they will walk in my, according to my law, right? And so the test is that I can provide anytime I want, and I'm going to do it just every day. And you're going to learn to trust only your daily bread, right? That's how we were taught to pray. Give us this day our daily bread. Trust God one day at a time. God can provide every day what you need. And the picture and the illustration goes back to, we learn to pray that way because this is how God did it. And he gives their daily bread. He gives them just enough. And there's the instructions about the Sabbath and all of that. But again, this is, in verse 7, verse 6 and 7, he says, in the evening you will know that Yahweh has brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of Yahweh. For he hears your grumblings against Yahweh. And what are we that you grumble against us? Moses even said, why are you complaining to me? I don't make food, right? God makes food. So God knows you're grumbling against him. And so the lessons, again, look at these because that's what Corinthians says. I get dual study time because I'm teaching and getting ready for 1 Corinthians 10, and these things are written for our instruction. So this is the very point of illustration, right? Learn the lessons. We read these and they're illustrative for us. We don't want to have the same attitude. And so complaining against, in general, automatically you kind of bypass everybody. When you're a complainer, you're really complaining against God. That's the lesson, right? And that's why we got to be careful about that attitude of, having a complaining attitude. It's a real serious offense. So Exodus 16 brings that out. And moving into chapter 17, we just kind of, if there's anything that you want to stop and ask questions about, raise your hand. But the next lesson about the water from the rock, right? In verse 1, it says, all this congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of Sin according to the command of Yahweh. And they camped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. So again, we're back to the water. The people contended with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them again, why do you contend with me? Why do you test Yahweh? Really, your problem is with Yahweh. It's not with me. I don't make water. So why are you complaining against me? They have to understand these things, right? And verse 4, Moses has to cry out. Their attitude so much that he says, what am I going to do with this people? Little more, and they will stone me. So Yahweh said to Moses, pass before the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. And behold, I will stand before the rock, before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, and the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders, and they named the place, right? So you have, again, the question at the end of verse 7, is Yahweh among us or not, right? He's either with us or he's not. Which way they can't have it both ways, but they keep trying to get it both ways, right? You're going to have times of testing. Deuteronomy will reiterate, there were times when God let you go without. There are times when God gave you abundance. Both of those are designed to test, so that will you trust God, right? God will bring us at times where we don't have enough. And he does that today, but he illustrates it with Israel, right? So these are the pictures that come before it. And is Yahweh among us or not? So, I bring up chapter 18 just for the point of you have some wisdom in the fact that Moses' leadership was pretty singular up until this point. Everybody went to Moses for everything, and when you have 2.5 or more million people going to you for everything, his father-in-law gives great counsel, right? The thing you are doing is not good. And here is just, this is an application of wisdom. God could have told him to do this, but he didn't. He allows this process to kind of work itself out. And listen to Jethro and understand the reasoning of the wisdom and say, yeah, we have to set up some leadership here. And we have to do it in a godly manner. And so they do it. And like verse 23 there says, if you do this thing and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure. And all these people will also go to their place in peace, right? Things are chaotic. And then, but here's the thing. Here's some general wisdom. This is how it should work. You can work it out this way. And then plus, if also God commands it, right? So you need to go to the Lord in prayer. You need to seek him about this plan that Jethro brings up. And when God allows it, then we'll know, that God, this is a godly direction and God will bring peace out of this, right?
You think Jethro was a man of God?
I do. Call him a priest at Midian, and I think he had pretty good understanding of a godly man. Yeah, I do. So you have that picture in chapter 18 that kind of comes out and illustrates godly wisdom. God doesn't command it, but it comes out, and they seek the Lord's favor in the practice of this, and then they do it, right? And so they're able to establish the elders of the tribes to handle the minor problems, right? A little bit of a structure similar to a church structure of elders and deacons. You kind of have a pattern and a picture of just, you need leaders to help handle problems, and they have to have godly character. They have to be faithful men. And so you have that picture in chapter 18. Now, we get into chapter 19, and hopefully, we'll see. We might spend the rest of our time through these chapter 19 and 20. But super important part of God meeting Israel and God displaying himself to Israel. So this is one of the more critical points in the whole Torah, the whole 5 books here, chapters 19 and 20 and so forth. So the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out, it says they came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they set out for Rephidim and came to the wilderness, camped in the wilderness. Israel camped in front of the mountain in verse 2. So that's, now you have the meeting place of God. Remember when they kept saying we need to leave Egypt and go out a 3 days journey and meet God? Well, several months later we get there. They've had some lessons along the way, and if you ever try to do the little dotted line path, it kind of squiggles around and loop-de-loops, and, they make their way through this wilderness back and forth, and by numbers, we'll be doing that for 40 years, right? But, so, there's never a direct path. God has all these lessons for them, and what could have been a very easy thing for them had they trusted the Lord became a very complicated thing because they didn't trust the Lord. And they're learning about that. And so a part of it is, these things are written for our instruction. We look at them and go, what's wrong with you? Except we would be in the same place ourselves. We have to understand the mercy and compassion of God to know that, hey, they needed that time in order to learn these lessons, right? And a part of it is the compassion of God, right? To say, I didn't just throw them away because they failed. I just made it take a lot longer, right? Than it should have, a 3 days journey to get here, because they needed that time. God is loving and compassionate. So when you get into the chapter 19, it says, now Moses went up to God in verse 3, 19:3, and Yahweh called to him from the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I lifted you up on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So now then, if you will indeed listen to my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. So the old covenant here, this law covenant, is a law covenant that engages Israel as a nation. and creates a unique, separated nation among all the other nations. It's not like all the other nations aren't God's. All the earth is mine. What you're going to do is you're going to have a special relationship status among all the nations and be a sacred possession, a separated possession of mine among all the other nations. It's not like it's you and all the other nations aren't mine. It's you special among all the other nations, and they're all mine. So God always owns the whole earth, right? Even today, nations are doing kooky things today, and there are wars and rumors of wars and all those things. God's in control of it all. They're all His nations. But the covenant that He's entering into them puts them as a unique possession among all the nations of the earth. And that's the kind of the importance of the law aspect of it. They're going to have a display. They're going to be a testimony and a witness to all the other nations of the earth. What does it mean to follow God? What does it mean to be a special nation among Him? Remember, He calls them as a kingdom of priests, right? And that's what He says in verse 6. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And right? So their status is that, just like an individual priest mediates between the people and God, the nation of Israel is a kingdom of priests that has a representative aspect between God and the other nations. The other nations are to seek Israel in that respect. How do I get close to God? How do I relate properly to Him? Well, look at the pattern of Israel and you'll understand. There are instructive elements to the national identity of Israel that can help the other nations know this is how I need to approach God, with humility, with trust, with the idea of needing to repent and be right with God and follow His laws and follow His wisdom. These are the aspects that they are teaching the other nations. And so when God meets them at Mount Sinai here in Exodus chapter 19, that covenant aspect, and this is that babysitting or mediating aspect, right? God says, I'm going to enter into this covenant with you, and you need to operate under this covenant until the new covenant comes in, which is Christ. So for Israel, this is their operation, their mode of operation with God. They enter into this agreement with Him to live as a nation until Christ should come. And then the new covenant alters, it changes the way it's going to operate from that point because He changes and transforms their hearts. And He's bringing in a new covenant to operate by, which is for the nations and for Israel. And so that's what's beginning, and that's why it's so important to understand this ratification of the covenant, which really takes the whole rest of the book. You realize they don't ever seriously ratify this in full agreement with the Lord because they keep failing at it until the end of the book. So the rest of the book is just explaining what does it mean to be a nation before God. They're going to set up the tabernacle. They're going to set up, the outline of the altar and the courts and everything that it involves with having God's presence among them. And it begins here in Exodus 19, and there's some pretty important parts. And so these are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel in verse 6, right? This is the beginning of the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments become the foundation and the groundwork for everything else that we're going to see in Exodus and Leviticus. When you get to the Levitical law and you're going, oh my gosh, all these details, right? But they're all just an expansion of these 10 commandments. They really go back and funnel back into these 10 commandments. Loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. That's the basis of the commandments. And that's the basis of the 10 commandments and how they expand into all the rest. And we'll get to that. But here, again, in chapter 19, they have this aspect of setting up boundaries to meet God and setting up preparation to meet God. And there's a lot of detail about we're going to set this boundary and don't cross it. If you go up there, you're dead, right? You cannot meet the presence of God the way you are. You're sinful people. And so God is teaching and illustrating them about holiness and about His glory. And, the first thing you should recognize is that God is holy and we are not, right? If you don't have that feeling of understanding, put yourself in their position and go, What would it be like standing before a mountain where God's going to come down and meet us? I have a little fear in that. I got a little fear in my heart, putting myself in that position, because I know I'm not ready to meet God. On my own, it would never happen, right? I'm a sinful person. And I think you're to gain that aspect of putting yourself in their shoes and understanding the holiness of God, because he really puts on a display. And he does so, in a very specific way. And so that's what happens here in chapter 9. Did I repeat? Yeah, chapter 19 is they begin to set it up and set the boundaries, and he says, this is where they're going to go. You're going to be a kingdom of priests. And the agreement is, all that Yahweh has spoken, we will do. You're going to see that phrase a few times. All he did was set up the boundaries and the conditions for meeting God. You just need to know that it's super serious coming to meet me. I haven't even told you what's going to happen yet. You just need to know that you're going to set boundaries. I'm going to come and explain to you. Moses is going to go up. You are not. In the simple version of it, and you better stand and watch the show as it unfolds, because I'm going to come and visit you. It's a pretty ominous preparation. This is not any old visit, right? This is about the most unique thing in the face of the earth. God says, you've seen what I did to the Egyptians, now I'm coming to meet you to establish this whole relationship. And it is truly ominous, right? And so they said, all that he has spoken we will do, and he brought the words of the people to Yahweh. And so now there's an agreement about how we're going to meet each other. Okay? Then it goes in and it says in verse 9, Yahweh said to Moses, behold, I will come to you in a thick cloud, so that the people may hear when I speak to you, and they may also believe in you forever. So a part of this meeting is that, why does Moses get to go up? Because it's going to establish that relationship of having a mediator and a leader and priest who stands before God and mediates with the people, and Moses is going to be established in their eyes. They're going to watch the cloud come down. They're going to see Moses go up into this cloud and know that he's meeting God. And the visible manifestation of it is going to secure Moses' leadership. They're going to know that this is indeed the guy that God has chosen, right? Because if he didn't, Moses would be dead. Moses would go up and meet him, and God would say, nope, and he would die, and that would be it. But Moses is allowed to live, and it establishes that presence of Moses being his chosen one. It goes on and says in verse 10, Yahweh said also to Moses, go to the people and set them apart as holy today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments, and let them be ready for on the third day, on the third day Yahweh will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. And you shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, beware that you do not go up to the mountain or touch the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned and surely shot through, whether beast or man, right? You don't even let him go. If you can stop him, basically. Don't even let him go up there and try to approach. So you have this whole kind of setup for the approach. Moses, as it says in verse 17 or verse 16, Moses, the God comes out. So it happened on the third day, when it was morning, that there was thunder and lightning flashes and a thick cloud upon the mountain and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. Was it a trumpet? It was a loud trumpet sound. We don't know what made the sound. We know God coming down to the mountain. There's flashes of lightning, thunder and lightning, and a loud trumpet sound along with the thick cloud, and it covers the mountain. Verse 17, Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. And now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, because Yahweh descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. So you have this picture of God coming down in his presence, and the mountain can barely handle it. It's falling apart because of the presence of God and his glory and power. I think the picture is that this mountain is having a hard time receiving the Lord. It's falling apart. It's a violent earthquake is happening because God is saying this is what it's like to meet God. The sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Then Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. So you have this response. Moses speaks when he sees this display. God answers him in the thunder. Again, it sets Moses up as the one. And so, Yahweh then, the priests can come near. They set themselves apart as holy. They have a certain distance. They have to stop. Moses and Joshua go up, and they're the ones. Well, this time Moses goes up, I think, but other times Joshua goes up with him. And
excuse me. So Joshua has seen God's face to face.
He's seen him face to face, but has he seen him the way the one time Moses sees him in that special passing in like chapter 38? No. Has he been up with Moses in the presence of the Lord in the mountain? Yes. But remember, that's not considered, let me see the front side of you, right? The full presence. There's always a veiled presence. Even now there's a veiled presence, and even when he has the glory of the Lord, there's a veiled presence. And, no man can see the front, as he said, the fullness of the Lord, or you'll die. So, yeah, he's seen something of the glory of God with Moses, yes. So, again, you have this whole picture of the Moses, as it says, they come out and they stood at the mountain to meet God, right? And it says, in chapter 19, we were looking at that, the whole thing is that God, kind of destroys the mountain. The mountain is crumbling under the weight of Yahweh's presence, and it's not handling it very well. And then in chapter 20, verse 1, at that time, in that mountain presence, God spoke all these words to them, saying, I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And he speaks the Ten Commandments. They audibly hear him teaching and instructing them with the Ten Commandments, right? And he does so. And as he's giving all of that instruction, at the end of it in verse 17, the last commandment, verse 18 says, all the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And the people perceived it, and they shook and stood at a distance. So they're very afraid over this manifestation of God's presence. They understand, one, God designed it for them to be afraid. And it had the right effect. They were afraid. They were designed to be afraid of the presence of God. And in verse 19, they said to Moses, speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But let not God speak to us, or we will die. Okay, so they have a very clear picture there about it, that this is a problem, right? So they don't want to perceive, as it says there, Moses, you need to start communicating with us. God speaking to us is too scary. And so God speaks the Ten Commandments directly to the nation of Israel, and they're like, we've had enough. This is frightening beyond belief. We're about to die if this continues. So, yeah.
Pretty short memory.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think it was a combination of what he was saying and they realized their sinfulness, or just
yes,
that, or that he's just awesome?
Two yeses. His holiness is above whatever they could imagine, and their sinfulness is exactly the thing that keeps them from his presence. They cannot approach God in their sinfulness. I think that the lesson there is very clear, and it's all about the holiness of God and the sinfulness of mankind. So all of that is enveloped in this lesson, and this is just one of my favorite manifestations of God and the lesson that's learned here. This is the very basis for the coming of Jesus Christ. Realize this. This mountaintop encounter is the very basis for the reason why Jesus Christ had to come and be born as a man and be one who was like them among them. Because when you get to Deuteronomy chapter 18, he says, remember when I visited you here on the mountain and how it was too much for you? And you said, we don't want God to speak to us anymore. He actually says in Deuteronomy 18, you spoke well. That was correct. That was the lesson you were supposed to learn. That's why I'm going to send a prophet from among you like your countrymen, Jesus. He's not going to come on a mountain with fire and holiness. He's going to come and look like you, so it's easier to understand. And so the whole design of having the Son of God be born among us and exist in human form, 100% God and yet fully human, is that it stems from this encounter with Jesus, or with God and Yahweh here on Exodus chapter 20 on Mount Sinai. He comes and scares the pants off of them and says, and they said, we don't like to meet God like this. We don't like it. It's too much. He says, good, because when Jesus comes, you'll understand why he came this way. This is one of the lessons of the importance of the incarnation. So he designs it to be frightening on purpose so that they understand the coming of Jesus and the need for it. So there's a lot of messianic importance to this encounter as well. It's central to their understanding of who Jesus is. So this is what they, and this is a part of, like in verse 20 when he says thus you shall say, to the son, 22, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen that I have spoken to you from heaven. You shall not make these other gods. You shall not make for yourselves anything like that, but you shall make an altar of earth for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings, your peace offerings, your sheep oxen, right? So now we start to see the sacrificial system come into play. And I will cause my name to be remembered, and I will come to you and bless you, right? So you have this whole picture about how now God is saying, you understand the significance of coming and meeting me and, coming before my presence. Now you're going to understand why you need sacrifices for sin, because I am that holy, right? And that need of it is kind of exemplified. And the whole picture of just having a natural altar, not a man-made altar, is that you don't get to fashion it in your own image. You just take natural stones and make it because I made the earth. It's my altar, right? And you put it up high so that you don't put it up high because there's no lewdness or exposing of the robes. There's modesty involved in the whole thing. And so why? Because what do the other nations do? They don't care if you see under their robes. They don't care about those things. He's like, no, we're not doing that, right? So you have this whole picture of God coming out to meet them, and that it is, again, you want to be frightened enough of God to know that I need to be dealing with my sin, right? I can't just treat it lightly. I have to take it pretty serious because God is serious. So if I had to come to you any less than this, you would not be afraid for your sin. But I want you to be afraid for your sin. And so you have this, again, this really great display in the middle of the book with the giving of the Ten Commandments about how serious God is and how holy he is. And that, it really sets the stage for the rest of the book and their encounters with God. It's all about encountering God and knowing God. And it kind of, this is outside of the Red Sea now. You had the personal presence of God exposed to them, and it causes them to fear God properly. So, as you get into chapter 23, kind of a few interesting points there about, this is the point where he says, not only do you have to know how to relate to God, but you better keep in mind your relationship with one another. Loving your neighbor as yourself. And just a few important points here. He says, think about this in the context of today's culture too. He says, you shall not bear false report, nor do you join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. That's kind of understood. You shall not follow the masses in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a case or so turn aside after the masses in order to cause justice to be... No rioting for justice. Don't do that. Don't run around and protest for justice. Don't follow the masses in those things. We see a lot of those today. Yeah. Do they have a falseness about them? Okay. I just brought this one up because it kind of hit me like this is something we're seeing today. So understand that, just because people get together and want to protest something doesn't make it right. Okay? And God warns about getting caught up in those things. Follow God. Don't worry about what the world's protesting. You know, they may have very few times they're right. There are probably a lot of times they're wrong. And you want to be careful about getting caught up in those things. So there's elements of wisdom, you know, that God just says, look, for Israel, don't do it. Don't come up. And am I on the right? Am I moving ahead here? Oh, no, I'm right. 23. Yeah. So there, just realize that as he's talking about how to do justice with your neighbor, how to treat your brother correctly, how to love your neighbor. It's like, don't get caught up in these, you know, that mentality of the masses. It just, there's a dangerous element to it, and you're not really following God when you're getting caught up in that, the mob mentality. Israel does this a few times, and God, you know, it never turns out well. You know, they're seeking justice with God, and they're not on the right side of things. So, chapter 24, when he gets into it and it talks about it in 24:7, the importance of this is that where it says, he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they all said, all that Yahweh has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. So you have these stages where God teaches a little bit, he instructs them, and they respond with the agreement, right? Because we're talking about covenant language. God is entering into a relationship with them that's cut and written down and ratified with their agreement. And it's the language of the official way that they would do it in these days. Covenants were very normal ways to operate, even in a kingdom. Kings would establish themselves with the people by writing a covenant. Said, look, I will rule over you, and you're going to have to pay taxes and do certain things, but I'll also protect you when it comes down to it and provide for the national benefit and good of the nation, right? They did those in covenants. God is not doing something completely different when he does this. He's doing it in a way they understand, so that as their king, God is explaining the covenant. Now, none of them are this detailed. This is the most detailed covenant you're going to ever see. And but God is explaining just how serious it is. If you're going to trust God, and I'm showing that you can, here's all the ways you got to think about in relationship to your neighbors. And then, do you agree? Right? And they said, yeah, we get it. We have to treat our neighbors differently. We have to understand this covenant aspect. And so they have agreement with it. And so they have this whole vision, right? Here's the appearance of God again in verse 9. And Moses went up with Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. And under his feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. Yet he did not stretch out his hand against the nobles of the sons of Israel, and they beheld, that's the important part, they beheld God, right? And they ate and drank. So now you have this stage of agreeing, and they get this picture and vision of God in his presence saying, I hear you, you've agreed, right? He's close and he's personal, present in this agreement, is that you came and said to me you would do this. I'm here to say, I hear you. So you have pictures in Exodus of this personal presence of God. 24:12, he invites him. Now Yahweh said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and remain there, and I will give you the stone tablets with the law and the commandment which I have written for their instruction. And so Moses arose with Joshua, his attendant, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. But to the elders he said, remain here for us until we return. So you have this picture of going up and getting additional instruction, additional revelation of the law, and Moses and Joshua. And that's where you see, like, this is where he's in the presence of God, right? So now Joshua enters in as this prominent figure in the nation of Israel, in the leadership of Israel, following Moses and being obedient and getting the privilege of going up with him.
Was he a Levite?
Joshua, I don't recall. I'd have to look it up. I don't have it in my head one way or another what tribe he's from.
Benjamin?
What's that?
Joshua from Benjamin?
Benjamin? Maybe you could look it up. But yeah, I don't recall offhand. Good question, though.
So the stone tablets were literally the second time the Ten Commandments were written.
The first time in 20 they were spoken.
So what's the Book of the Covenant?
Now, what you'll see later on, it's even referred to this book, because now it stretches out over chapters. This book was written by God, by the finger of God, and we'll see that. God says, I wrote it myself.
Not book, you mean the tablets?
The tablets and the additional.
But what in verse 7, what's that referring to?
When he says in verse 7, he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. This is the stone tablets that God wrote.
So it's like, even though he...
No, they asked him, don't let God do it.
Yeah, but I thought we're just getting to the point where he goes up and gets the stone tablets.
It's kind of you'll see this in stages and kind of, little loops is what's going to happen, because there are times when Moses goes up and down from the mountain and stays there longer. Like right now, he's going to go up and stay there for quite a bit.
Don't really put this in exact chronology.
It's not super chronological. It's more the point that this ratification that was taking place with the people, God's presence was there, and it was their agreement to it, right? So as Moses reiterated it, they agreed to it. And that's, I think, the main point. So this is a stage of being in this presence of God and the mountain, Moses reading it, their agreement to it, and then Moses going up to get further. So it's not exactly, it's hard to fit it sometimes chronological. But
He's from Ephraim.
Ephraim, okay, there you go.
What's that?
He was born in Egypt from Ephraim.
Ephraim.
Tribe of Ephraim, yeah.
Ephraim was, I forget.
Joseph.
Oh, Ephraim was Joseph's son.
Yes. Yep. Ephraim and Manasseh, I think, are the two from Joseph. Yeah. Yep. So, and you get up in chapter 24, in verse 9, again, they go up and they meet in Moses, and he's able to go up with Joshua to the mountain of God, and the Moses elders stay behind. And so, verse 12, they go up and they meet him, right, in chapter 24:12. And then I kind of skip now. I am going to skip. You have a lot of description about the altar, about the construction of the tabernacle. We're getting to the end of our time today. Are there any questions about that? Anything you want to know about the construction? God has very specific design for it. And you'll see that not only does he have a specific design, but like chapter 31, he gives very specific God-given wisdom. You couldn't build this without me giving you the skill and ability to build it. Right? So he gives their Beazel, and however you want to say, Oholiab. I'm not great at my Hebrew, so good. You can take a stab at that. But they get the wisdom in chapter 31 to be able to build the tabernacle, and 31:18 is kind of where we'll end. And this is what happens at the end of this encounter with God. This is all the instruction about how they're going to walk with the Lord and build this tabernacle to have the presence of the Lord among them. And they get the wisdom for it from God. And it says, when he had finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, he gave Moses the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written by the finger of God. So, again, from before in chapter 30 to 31, it's kind of this condensed version of it, where I look at it like, just a little scene of the whole encounter that God's highlighting for them. And out of it comes all of this instruction. They've received instruction about building the tabernacle. Later on they'll build it, but this is the instruction for it. So we're going to do another week of Exodus. We'll get into finishing Exodus next time, starting in chapter 32. If you want something that's written for our instruction, this is the chapter to pay attention to. It's written for our instruction. So we'll finish and start in chapter 32. Father, we thank you for this time that we have to learn from your word, and just pray, Lord, that we move at the right pace to understand the main points, to enhance our reading and understanding of these important scriptures. And may it be truly instructive to us, Lord, that we would walk right with you and it would cause us to know you more. In Jesus' name, amen.
I'm always